Hello everyone. I hope everyone can see and hear me. Great. So yeah, I hope you had a great day so far. Um, yeah, my day was actually pretty good as most of the time. The only thing is that like the weather is really weird at the moment here. Like it's rainy and then it's sunny. Cannot really decide apparently. It's always feels a little weird seeing that in the background. Yeah. Great. So, yeah, just to start with a little introduction. As you maybe know, I'm Christian. I'm co-founder of the tool Echometer and also the initiator of Project Scagile. And the whole idea of Project Scagile is to help you scale Agile the right way to make your Agile transformation successful. And we are trying to do this by sharing experiences and by trying to, yeah, to use the community that we have to make sure that best practices that there are shared. And yeah, for doing so, we interviewed many different experts like from all over the world on this topic. And today's session is on this topic of horizontal communication, because you probably know that like silos in general are often a problem. And today's session is really about, okay, how can you communicate horizontally? What could become some best practices in that direction that can help to align teams also in this horizontal level, because the frameworks often talk heavily about this vertical level. Yeah, you will see the rest later. Yeah, so what's important to mention is that this is an on-demand webinar, because we interviewed all of these experts, and it's pretty much impossible to get all of them together at the same time. So we decided to record them, and so you will see a video now in a few minutes. The advantage of that is, that you get a lot of information in a short amount of time. And generally, yeah, what you can expect from today's session is, again, like a few very specific best practices that you can implement it also in your Agile transformation that are proven methods basically to make sure that this horizontal communication is going in the right direction too. All right. Okay, did I want to say something else? Okay, yeah. The only thing that I'm always saying is this is a lot of information in a short amount of time. So I recommend that you, take out a pen or something similar and be prepared to write thoughts that you like down. And yeah, then we'll see us at the end of the session. I will now start the video. Have fun. Till later.
That aspect of working with multiple teams, it can be quite a difficult challenge.
A lot of the frameworks talk about vertical communication very, very easily. They talk about chief product owner. They talked about a product owner team. They talk about scaling up.
Now the horizontal communication, that is a little more challenging.
Agile at scale can mean only a few, but also hundreds of teams. How do you align all of these teams around one goal while at the same time breaking down hierarchies?
If you're seeing that there's a lot of cross dependencies between your trains, chances are you may want to take a look at reorganizing.
Within a nice blog article from Michelle Parsons on LinkedIn, she says, forget about agile versus waterfall. Those are not the solutions for the inefficiency of your organization. The solution is to bust silos. That's the core problem of most of the organizations. The thing is, if we talk about scaling agile, this is most of the time focusing on this vertical integration and not this horizontal alignment of your teams.
A lot of the frameworks talk about vertical communication very, very easily. They talk about chief product owner. We talked about a product owner team. They talk about having a program level that has specific roles that support that vertical integration, and then different layers. And they all talk about scaling up.
So the frameworks that are supposed to help you scale agile typically don't give too many guidelines on how to communicate and align horizontally. The core approach often is that they say you have to align around value creation for your customer. We have a whole webinar on that topic. Feel free to check that out. aligning around value basically means that every single team and department of yours knows exactly how they are benefiting the end customer. But that's not easy to get right.
If you're seeing that there's a lot of cross dependencies, between your trains, chances are you may want to take a look at reorganizing, right, around value.
So Maureen says, theoretically, if you are correctly organized around value, this means that so-called agile release trains, or in short, ARTs, which typically means, that's like 5 to 15 development teams, those are independent areas, kind of departments that are, working for themselves. The question is, do they communicate with each other?
And it's not to say that you don't want those trains communicating, but if there's so many dependencies across trains that you're having, to manage that large solution level, things just get more complicated, right? Ideally you have these small cross-functional teams within your art, and it doesn't matter like what feature they take, they can just pull it right from the backlog and they can take any feature.
So if we are organized in a few agile release trains and having a few hierarchical levels, the question we should ask ourselves now is, how do we make sure that the silos long-term really are busted? How do we make sure that all of our employees are communicating horizontally so that they feel like one organization, all running in the same direction and being able to innovate? One answer to this is horizontal communication itself. Maybe, the frameworks don't tell the whole story here. Vivek is giving a first few thoughts on how to foster horizontal communication.
What we did is we brought in some of the traditional project management also into the mix. When we started our Safe Agile, we were told that project management is dead. What I noticed is that that's not entirely true. I think there is a need for project management even in the safe organization, and that's what exactly they're supposed to do. Now that role can be played by Scrum Master. It's not that you need to have a separate really project manager person defined. The roles and responsibilities Safe prescribes for a Scrum Master is really kind of coaching. If I have to use one word, they are just coaches. That's what Safe says. You are just coaches, and your job is to remove any kind of barriers. So you are not proactively managing any resources or making things. You're not kind of going after things. Let team do that. Okay, but team, in my experience, would fall short if they have to coordinate with a lot of other groups, right? So that's a responsibility that's basically a traditional project management work. Before PI planning, I would say some of this responsibility has to be taken care of by product owner by aligning with other teams, and which they generally do. But after PI planning, after work has been scheduled, Safe doesn't say very clearly that how this has to be coordinated across, because once again, the Safe assumes that you have done your thorough job of putting everything in the right art, and you have created your value stream. So you don't probably have too much of coordination going across, but that doesn't happen in practice. So you need Scrum Masters or somebody with some kind of project management or program management skill to do this extra level of coordination across all the trains and making sure everybody is aligned at the right times. Safe does have something called Art Sync as a cadence, but not very effective, honestly. You need more than that.
Okay, so maybe even implement some traditional project management methodologies, which could also be part of your Scrum Master role. We will now proceed with specific other best practices that your coaches could implement. Eric is starting with a pretty interesting thought.
The funny part is that when it talks about horizontal, what I like to say is this: when it comes to horizontal communication, what do we do today outside of work? How do I know about my community? How do I know about my alumni that I went to school with? How do I become involved in the things that I'm interested in, and as well as learn from others in the same field? And the funny part is we look at that, then we actually see that horizontal communication is actually something we do very well outside of work.
That is an interesting thought. He's saying that this communication between artificial structures is something that comes natural to us. He's giving examples.
So examples for you, of course. So centers of practices, a very common one. Center of practice, have a topic anyone can share. One of the things I recently did at a previous client was a book club. The organization had a lot of people in the military, and we went through team of teams as a way to start it. And the book club was very interesting because we had a very interesting thing that happened was that they would share an example from their environment about, well, this is what we did in our team based on this concept that we read in Team of Teams. It's a good book about the military and about a lot of these concepts on how do we communicate, how do we vision cast, how do we decentralize. And by sharing that across each other, it created that horizontal communication. Another thing that's very interesting is online gaming. We do this naturally. We join guild. Why do we join a guild in online gaming? Why do we want to be part of that group of people? And one of the things I like to say is have people form guilds where they present a topic, where they even can deliver value together. Now you're mixing people together from different value streams, from different parts of the organization, and they have a reason to be together. Why do people go to science fairs, right? You go to science fair, hey, or you go to a job fair. Wait, what does your company do? What does your team do? Showcase what you do. Have people, that's interesting. I want to learn more about that. Encourage that curiosity. So when it comes to horizontal communication, I think we already have it. We just try to separate the fact that we can't do that at work because, wait a minute, you want me to form a guild? You want me to do a book club, have science fair? That seems not work-ish. But those behaviors that we do outside of work really is how we horizontally communicate today. Because we don't report to Toastmasters, for example, but why are we part of Toastmasters?
Great. So if you want to succeed long-term as an organization, you have to regularly innovate. You have to make sure that the one idea meets the other idea cross-fertilizing. For example, that, Steve Jobs meets Steve Wozniak so that they can have this together, this great idea. And those initiatives that Eric is mentioning, they are a first step in this direction. And yes, even a book club can be such an initiative, or the community of practice.
In the book, Better, Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier, that I mentioned earlier, they talk about a ways of working center of enablement as opposed to a center of excellence, which is a really interesting concept. But it all comes back to coming up, some people might call that a community of practice. There's different terms for that. But, those are all really important tools to help us kind of share things that are working and get those out to the rest of the group.
So community of practice was mentioned by Eric, by Philip, and also by Sean in context of their massive agile scaling.
The current company I'm at is an entity that was bought by a large organization. The current company I'm at was already implementing scaled agile, and we were delivering so well that the larger organization saw it, and they said, "Wow, you guys are delivering. You're just doing so well. We want to implement that on our organization." So they saw the smaller fish doing so well. They're like, "How do we do it?" So we've been coaching and mentoring and training and teaching, and it went from 4 arts on my particular company to now we have probably 30 arts across the organization, and we're still growing. They've grown their agile transformation office. We have it at the enterprise level as well as my company level, and we work together. We have meetings together. We have communities of practice together so we can share the knowledge that we've learned. And if people have questions, we use our group knowledge to help them.
Okay, so communities of practice in their case is obviously one of many measurements, and it's also to make sure that scaling agile itself is working. Now to zoom out a little, another core reason why we should be in this constant horizontal communication process was mentioned by Philip.
I think we also have to acknowledge how significant dependencies are and how massive their impact is. So Troy McGinnis speaks a lot about dependencies and how huge their impact is. Just to use an example he gives on that people can relate to, well, pre-pandemic. So if you're going to a dinner party at a nice restaurant and maybe there's 20 people and it's the type of place where you can't be seated until everybody's there. Well, what's the probability of being seated on time? Well, it turns out it's not very high because, the chances of one person, 2 people, 3 people being late are quite significant. If you take that simple example and kind of extend it to teams, you can see why dependencies are so concerning, because basically with each additional dependency that we need to consider, it essentially halves our ability to start something when we thought we were going to start it. And that's obviously a big problem.
I think this is a nice example showing the significance of dependencies, which have a completely different dimension in a scaled agile context. Another pattern we identified that will help you to decrease the negative effects of those dependencies was introduced by Kevin.
In order to facilitate or foster the knowledge transfer, I see 3 driving factors. The first is you should really consider making pair programming part of your definition of done. In our case, we actually said, please make a strong consideration of doing that. Of course, it's not 100%. For some tasks, it doesn't make sense, but consider doing that. It will change your teams and your products. One example, it's inevitable that people will leave your project. And very often it's something that you are afraid of. Knowledge will be lost. If you have working pair programming methods in place, first of all, this loss is no longer such a big loss anymore because you have this knowledge in the team. And secondly, you are gaining. I mean, this person might change to another project. Your organization is gaining somebody who's not only able to do his task, but is also aware of all the other perspectives in the team or in the project because he or she has worked with so many other people closely together.
Kevin said even putting this in your definition of done. Interesting approach. Maureen also talked about pair programming.
The way that you start to get groups horizontally to connect is through pair work. And it's just one of those cultural things that everybody's so focused on utilization, being 100% busy, that we don't necessarily think as developers that the first thing I should do is try to help somebody else get their work done. Cultivating a pair work mentality, starting within your agile teams, or whether it's Scrum or Kanban, but cultivating that attitude is really important, right? Okay, hey guys, before you pull something from the backlog, can you help a friend? Because that's a new mentality, right? Can you help, your partner, your coworker before you pull something else from the backlog, right?
Similar to pair programming is something mentioned by Philip.
Let's say that there are 2 teams, they're working on, really closely related functionality. So what I've often tried to do in that context, that's not a big time hit for the teams, is for like their daily scrum, basically you have a member of each team go to the other team's daily scrum, and mainly just to listen, and then they bring back what they hear to their own team. So that's a fairly, easy lift. It's not going to have a, huge impact on anybody's time. Depending on how significant the dependencies are, you can do other things that are a little bit more involved, like you can temporarily assign one person from one team to the other team and vice versa. And that, that kind of builds the knowledge and the understanding. So those are just a couple of ways to do it.
Okay, so we have communities of practice, book clubs, guilds, pair programming. Now let's have a look at how the frameworks are trying to help us communicate horizontally.
We can apply the same principles to solve that, just like we would if we scaled a small team. Normally what we would do is we would put a layer of leadership focusing on the roadmap just above that. Now, just scale that again. So now you have your different teams, and now each team has their own person creating the roadmap or their own team creating the roadmap. And now you just add an additional layer above that to do that again, to align those scaled teams, those programs.
So as you heard, again, frameworks are answering this question through adding layers on your hierarchical levels that are supposed to coordinate. And those come in different names. Steve is elaborating on this.
Interestingly enough, I have seen coordinating agile release trains or programs require 8-10 people. I've also seen it require just one person to help the communications go back and forth. But you almost always need someone there responsible for those communications, those synchronization sessions to move it forward. I think Scrum at Scale calls it an S3. So they call it the S2 is the scrum of scrums, where you get all your scrum teams together to talk. And then if you have those programs, you have an S3 where all those programs get together and talk. And that's really all you need to do. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic principle.
All right, and this Scrum of Scrums philosophy is something that was also mentioned by Philip.
One of the classics, that's the Scrum of Scrums, type of construct. So what that can look like can certainly vary considerably from organization to organization, but I think there are certain elements to that, that need to be in place for that to be a workable potential solution or partial solution. One of those is you need to have the right people in the conversation. You need to not have too many people in the conversation, because if it's 50 people and everybody's trying to talk, that's not going to work in that kind of context, unless 40 of those 50 are just there to listen and not, they might take action afterward.
If you do the Scrum of Scrums or similar meetings, invite the right people. That is very important, also from this perspective that many people are seeing meetings as a waste of time. That again has a lot to do with the fact that they are often sub-optimizing something in their own silo. As a side note, in the article I mentioned to you in the beginning, Michelle Parsons talks about big room planning, which is a nice methodology to make sure that those meetings are not a waste of time, and they heavily help you to communicate horizontally. I recommend to have a look at big room planning. Now let's get back to Scrum of Scrums. Again, that's how some call it. More abstractly, John calls it sync meetings.
So twofolds. One, I'm a big fan of sync meetings. There is a prerequisite for having an effective sync meeting, and that's clear roles and responsibilities. So whatever framework you're using, if you're using SAFe and you have Agile release trains, or using one of the other frameworks and having pods or tribes or whatever, it's very important to identify who is responsible for the execution, who is responsible for the product or the voice of the customer. Having those very clear roles and responsibilities identified will allow you to create the proper syncs within the organizations, right? Oftentimes in organizations, they create these roles, they create these titles, but they don't have any idea what their responsibility is to the rest of the organization. And you see these problems start to fester over time, and they changed titles and they moved people into different roles, but they still have the same anti-patterns, right? So really understanding what those roles and responsibilities up front, getting those people talking on a consistent basis in a very synchronized manner will help us align horizontally throughout an organization.
Okay, so another way to make sure that the right people are in the room is to very clearly lay out their roles and responsibilities. To give you some more food for thought here, we at Echometer are organized in a framework called holacracy. And in holacracy, you are basically organized in roles, which means that every single role has a very specific purpose, one specific purpose, and also very clearly defined all the responsibilities the role has. This is transparent to anyone within the organization. So we have everything we do in an abstract way laid out here, which is massively helping us within all of our processes. John now is going a little deeper regarding those sync meetings.
So you want all your product folks or the people that are the voice of the customers syncing up on a consistent basis to making sure that we're building the right thing, that we're focused on that customer and meeting a specific need or solving a specific problem for that customer. And at the same time, from an execution standpoint, right, the left hand needs to know what the right hand is doing. And in order to do that, you have to pull the people that are responsible for that, whether it be a release train engineer or a chief scrum master, or senior or Uber scrum master, whatever you call it in your organization. Those people need to be talking together. And more importantly, they need to understand how their roles and responsibilities impact the other organization. If I have a dependency on another team, right, that scrum master needs to know that he or she needs to deliver that dependency in a certain time frame in order to unblock my team.
A very specific kind of subtype of those sync meetings can be the so-called retro of retros.
You have different ways to facilitate this in more of a cross-team setting. So, historically, some people refer to that conversation as a program retrospective or a retrospective of retrospectives, different terms. SAFE obviously has its own terminology, but what's nice about those conversations is you get the cross-team perspective, and typically in the cross-team type of setting, you also have some representation from leadership, probably some stakeholders, and so you get a really nice broad perspective.
One of my favorite things to do is what's called a scale retro. So this is the idea where you have it where you're doing a very big room retro. You can do this virtually too as well. And what happens is that you have a member from each level of the organization who's a member of a team.
Now, retrospectives are the key ceremony in Agile. We actually have a whole free webinar on this topic, including also this topic of retros. Feel free to check that out. Philip now has one last thought on this sync meetings and what every one of those should contain.
Last but not least, and most importantly, I would say, is what's the follow-up? So you can have a scrum of scrums. Oftentimes important information is shared, but if there is no clear, follow-up on the things that were communicated in there, if the communication kind of dies in that room and the teams, don't really know what happened, or some decision was made and they don't hear about it till a week later, that's going to be a problem. So you do have to work through that, and I do think you can get a lot of mileage out of it, a scrum of scrums context, provided that you do some of the things I just mentioned.
Okay, old but gold. Have some very well thought through follow up for these kinds of meetings so that people are gaining trust in their efficiency. Okay, coming back to our next best practice, do you remember that we said horizontal communication is something that is natural to us? If that is the case, then the only thing that people need is to be allowed to do so, which means that they have some free time.
You need to protect free time. In some frameworks, you have a sprint just for doing that, for innovation. In other frameworks, you talk about only 80% load, or there's different approaches to that. You should really protect that. I mean, the people that I worked with and are working with, they want to learn. Learning is not something that the organization has to force onto people. It's something that they have to allow. So if you just give some free time to your employees, they will do the learning for themselves. They will find what to know. They will find the people who to teach. It's not that you have to say, hey, you go to this person and talk to them. That's no longer necessary if you just give them some time.
All right, so protect free time, and there'll be definitely some things that will evolve naturally. Good point. Let's get back to the next thing. You should take the time to introduce the right tools, which are helping you to facilitate all the communication processes that are going on.
The second side of that equation, obviously, is the tools that we're using, right? And the tools are only as good as the people who are using it, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So if you have clear roles and responsibilities and the right people in the right roles that are feeding whichever tool that you're using, whether that be Jira, Jira Align, Azure DevOps, Rally, version 1, right? That information is going to be consistent. It's going to be in real time. So myself on one team, looking at another team, or that information rolling up horizontally across teams is in a consistent manner. So I know when this team is planning to work on it, when they're planning to be able to finish it, and when I can start to pick up that work. And if there's any delays in that system, that's getting communicated in real time.
All right, so check out the tools that are on the market to make sure that they are supporting the initiatives that you are starting. Something that is connected to this, and another interesting thought, aiming at creating transparency to foster communication, is by Kevin.
The third thing that I recommend to be a very big driver for organizational learning and this transparency of knowledge in an organization is you should consider making your projects open source. Make your code base, your product open source as much as possible, at least internally. You don't have to go to GitHub or whatever, but at least make it visible to all your employees. Make it feasible that people can commit changes to other projects that they are not working with. If they have a little bit of spare time, and they see a project and they see, hey, I can contribute here, they will love to do that. So it's only about the restrictions that you put on your employees that are hindering organizational learning. Everybody wants to do that by heart. Yeah, everybody wants to do that. You just need the allowance to do that.
Interesting thought. I mean, it's rather radical in its nature probably, but it would still definitely help to increase the trust and communication and maybe even to bust silos. Now the last thing I wanted to talk about is something that we talked about in the beginning, which is this idea of aligning around value.
The biggest challenge is most businesses are aligned around tools and or skills. And I think for any business to be successful, you need to align around your customer's value.
The group that wants to scale is not always organized around value. It's like a silo that says, I want to launch this initiative. But what they haven't done is they haven't really looked at that whole value stream map.
Okay, so again, we have a whole free webinar on this topic of how do you align around value, and if you are serious about horizontal communication and busting silos, I highly recommend to have a look at that. Now to summarize the key points of this webinar: give people the free time to organize cross-train and department events and initiatives, for example like communities of practice, book clubs, guilds and so on. Also implement this pair work mentality, maybe even thinking about implementing it in your definition of done. Next, have some kind of scrum of scrums or sync meetings between the layers. And at last, implement the right tools. If you are doing all of that, the chances that your teams are all aligned and running in the same direction are already a lot higher. The last thing that is slightly connected to all of this, obviously, is your organizational culture.
It's interesting, right? Because everybody wants to change their culture. Oh, we're going to have this culture change. And just because leadership wants to change the culture doesn't mean culture is going to change.
For me, as organizational psychologist, what can I say? Culture does eat strategy for breakfast.
More than tools and methodology, it's essentially a mindset change.
Humans just resist change, and that's the biggest challenge.
Getting people to accept change.
Changing our behaviors, changing our beliefs is really difficult.
The cultural shift. That is often the most challenging, and that's where we need to spend the most time.
Yes, that was it. I really hope that there were some inspirational thoughts. What would be really helpful for us if you would now give us a quick feedback. On the right side of your screen, you should now be able to see a little survey, just one question, one click for you, how much you like the webinar and how much you would recommend this. This is really helpful for us because, then we can use this to also iterate on the webinars. And we'll definitely repeat these webinars. So if you liked it, feel free to write us or to share the webinar directly with your colleagues. And the last thing, the thing is that obviously, it's hard to share your personal experiences within these kinds of webinars. So if you are interested to talk to other practitioners who are in a similar situation, we have one offer for you if that's interesting. You can do what we call an Agile maturity assessment, which is a very quick, 3-minute survey. And you fill this out, and then what you get is what you can see right here now. It's like a little benchmark in different categories compared to others. What's your positioning and what's your maturity level regarding those categories? Which is like a little inspiration for you. Where are you at the moment regarding agile maturity? And on the other hand, if you want to, you can also decide to say, okay, I would be open to be connected to others who are in a similar situation. And then what we'll do is, write an introduction via email so that you can each other, just that you can communicate or maybe schedule a call together so that you can share your mutual experiences within your agile transformation. All right. Again, I hope that you liked it. If you have any more feedback, feel free to write me, to write us. And then have a great day. Thanks a lot. I hope that was like a little inspirational half an hour. Bye bye.